Good morning, everyone. We are continuing with what we're now calling Living in the Light. I'm Asha Nayaswami. Let's begin with a prayer. Heavenly Father, Divine Mother, Friend, Beloved God, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Lahiri Mahashaya, Swami Sri Yukteswar, Beloved Master Paramhansa Yogananda, Saints of all religions, humbly we bow to you all. Help us to feel your presence, that the words we speak become an actual experience. Help us to know that you are closer to us than our closest friends, that you are living within our own hearts, guiding and blessing everything that we do. Help us to receive you, that we may be transformed in your light. Om. Peace. Amen.
I'm sorry, there doesn't seem to be audio coming out.
Okay. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Oh, lucky enough to get two
Oh,
friends.
can I get a mirror real quick?
Yeah.
Okay, it's back.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Should we start over
Yeah,
from the very
let's-
beginning? Okay. Did anybody hear me or did they just see me pantomiming?
They just saw your pantomime.
Mm-hmm. Okay, let's pretend. Okay, we'll just start all over again. You ready? Apparently, I was just pantomiming a few moments ago, so here we're going to do the same thing with sound. This is Living in the Light, Conversations with Asha Nayaswami, which is me, talking about that, which is the most important thing that we can learn. So let's start with the prayer. Heavenly Father, Divine Mother, Friend, Beloved God, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Lahiri Mahashaya, Swami Sri Yukteswar, Beloved Master Paramhansa Yogananda, Saints of all religions, dearest friend Swami Kriyananda, help us to understand your true teachings. Above all, help us to experience your presence within. Be our best friend, never leaving our side, always whispering wise advice, uplifting our hearts and guiding our footsteps, that we may move with quiet confidence and great joy, ever nearer to thy divine light, until nothing exists for us except your loving presence. Om. Peace. Amen. I was just thinking about various teachings or writings of Swamiji that might be of interest for us to go through, which is what I've just been doing. All these, after so many years and so many different initiatives that Swami did, some things that were very important at the time sort of fall by the wayside. I've actually suggested to several different people who are in a position to act upon it that we need to start creating a website which is called the Collected Papers of Swami Kriyananda. I think his collected papers are probably bigger than all of his books combined. That's just a guess. I don't even mean his correspondence. I just mean different letters that he wrote, and letters he wrote to the public and essays and things like that. Well, considering how wide the bookshelf is that contains all his books, maybe I'm not sure, but we'll see. In any case, I have this little pamphlet. It's called A New Dispensation. It has coffee stains on it or something like that. One of my books, it's actually this book here, which is the original version of The Path, which was a numbered edition, and Swamiji gave me number 5. I was involved in helping to produce this book, so he did. And I can't remember exactly what the page is, but one time in my life at Ananda Village, when I was living in my little trailer, a raccoon got into my trailer. It only happened once. And this book was sitting open on my table because I was reading it, and the raccoon with muddy feet walked across a certain page. Far from being distressed, I was actually really happy because it was just such a charming memento of the life that I was living then. But his footprints were actually just dust, and I think over time they dried and they left. But some of the things that I have of my life with Swamiji, I'll just put it there, of my life with Swami I've had forever. So I hold up copies of things like this and nobody recognizes them because they've been replaced 2 or 3 times. So this is a tiny pamphlet, and it's called A New Dispensation. And he published this. He said he'd been 30 years on the path when he published it. So it would have been sometime in the 80s. And it's about attunement. And attunement is a very difficult thing to talk about. And it's also about what he called the ray of grace, which is this particular line of teaching. And it's a wonderful little pamphlet, and it's been lost over time. I was going to summarize it, but I actually think I just may read at least 2 pages of it now, and then just sort of work with it. Because this is a shorter program, I'm not sure how reading will go, but I will still just try that. So Swami writes this, and part of what this was is this is when he introduced the idea that you could, let me just see. No, he was trying to make Ananda a membership. He called it, it's published by what's called the Ananda Spiritual Family. Over the many years of Swami's life, he was always experimenting with different ways of how to articulate that which was really formless, and find words and find methods for getting people involved in the right way. I'm going to digress, and we'll see how close I get to even reading this. But one of the hardest things to do, one of the hardest things to balance, is the necessity to organize sufficiently so that people can understand and recognize what you're doing. And Swami was always trying to make Ananda a movement of consciousness. And in that way, you could have some form to it, but by calling it a movement rather than an institution or even a church at that point, we were not using that word, it would help people to understand what they were getting involved with. Because the great bane of religion over many centuries has been that it gets a fixed form. And then people get a fixed form, and then they no longer remember that this is my personal relationship with God. They begin to think that it is my relationship to some form. So people rebel against that. People will come and they'll say, I don't like organized religion. And, my obvious question is, well, do you prefer disorganized religion? And what is it that you're actually saying? And because we pick up random pieces of things, would you rather come in on Sunday and not know where you're supposed to sit and have there be no order to the service, and nobody's going to help you learn the chants, and nobody will know your name, and after it's all over, somebody will hand you a broom. I mean, it's just we have to have some system. I mean, the human body itself, Swami would often comment on this, the human body is highly organized. Everything in creation is highly organized. I have a little pond out in the back garden here in the house that I live in. It's the community house, and so it has an extra more space than most of the apartments have. But there's a little pond back there, and there were goldfish in the pond. And when I first was living in this house, I would look out the back, the big sliding glass door, and there was this beautiful white heron. And white heron is so majestic, and he would walk through the garden, and I would see him regularly. He was just wonderful. And he came for a while until he'd eaten all the goldfish. And then he didn't come anymore because there was no more buffet lunch being offered in the back garden. Whenever I think about things like that, I always think of the nature movies that you see sometime, and the both the music and the cinematography and the script, it involves you in the life of some animal. And since nature is always about eating or being eaten, there's always a certain drama. And if you're happy, if you're seeing the movie from the point of view of the heron, then you're delighted that he has a buffet breakfast in my backyard and he can just eat all those goldfish. If you're seeing the movie from the point of view of the goldfish, you're just sort of sitting there terrified that the heron's going to eat you. But both sides are perfectly valid. It just depends on where you're personally involved. One of my favorite scenes from a nature video movie, favorite because of the horrifying implications of it. I believe the movie was called Winged Migration. That might be the name of it. It was this amazing movie about birds, just extraordinary. And it seems to me that this was the first scene of the movie, but I'm not certain. I believe there's a bird. I know I've talked about this before, so if you've heard it before, you're going to hear it again. I believe the bird is a cuckoo. And the cuckoo, or whatever it is, the cuckoo is a very irresponsible parent, or a very clever parent, depending on your perspective, because it finds a nest, and it lays its egg in that nest, and some other bird doesn't have enough brain to realize that it's been invaded, and it just takes care of that egg as if it was its own, and then the little bird comes out, and somebody else just raises it, and the cuckoo is off just having whatever good times cuckoos have. I don't know. I brought it up. I know now why I've mentioned it, because I mention it specifically whenever I talk about my friend who was the 12th child in a West Texas cattle ranching family. And all 11 of his siblings are still in Texas in one way or another involved with cattle. And he is the artistic director of the Minneapolis Ballet Company. And I met him when he was a dancer in San Francisco. He's a ballet dancer. I mean, he was a cuckoo egg. There's just no question. He was just dropped into that family for some reason, and they raised him and then sent him off to the West Coast to be a ballet master. So be it. But in this movie, in the movie, what you have is you have three blind birds who were just, hideous when they first, excuse me. If I were their mother, I would think they were beautiful. My standard is that they don't match my concept of beauty. They're charming, but they're bulbous and they're bony and they have weird necks and their eyes are closed, and mostly they just sit with their mouths open going cheep, 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 and then the bird comes and regurgitates. Well, I'm thinking of another goofy thing at this point. Swamiji was the most unsentimental person that I knew. He had deep feeling, but he was not sentimental. And he was deliberately not romantic. He didn't romanticize things. And people can be very sentimental about motherhood and so on like that. And he said this to a friend of mine who, I have to add, even though she has been a mother multiple times. I mean, has raised several children. She's a wonderful mother, but she's not at all sentimental about it. Even being pregnant, she said it's just an intensely physical experience. She loves her children, but so she had come to visit Swami when she had a small baby at home, and she had to leave because she had to go nurse the baby. And then Swami said, "Time to go deliver the old regurgitated worm." Like that. And, sometimes Swami would tease us because we would tend to fall into these, sort of misty dreams about things where we just kind of let what we'd read in magazines and books take over our minds. I once realized when a woman came to me, God bless her, and told me that, she was really wanting to have this perfect love relationship. And then she referenced a movie. She wanted to have a relationship just like, and then she named the two actors had in this movie. As it happened, I had seen the movie. It was, well, I wish I could think of a P.G. Woodhouse phrase that would say it exactly. It was pure oatmeal. It was just mush. There was nothing realistic about it. And here this poor woman is waiting for her life to look like that movie, which, I mean, fortunately, it's never going to look like that movie. That movie was a nightmare of fantasy. Why I saw it, I don't know, but I did see it. And I realized in that moment that for most of us growing up, our source, and this is about personal relationships, is from novels, from television, from movies, from romantic songs. All of that is fiction. None of that is life. And definitely none of that is wisdom. It's fiction. Then we have this fiction. And then we are so confused because life is not fiction. This is why we have Education for Life. That's why that was one of Master's most important projects and one of Ananda's most important projects. Swami says, it'll just take several generations to straighten all this out. Generations where the children are really raised not on fiction, but on real life experience. So I'm going to keep backing up. I'm all the way back now where the cuckoo in this movie, the opening scene, here's this nest, and we have 3 fledglings. Or maybe they're not called fledglings when they're that small, but anyway, there they are, cheeping with their eyes closed like that, waiting for the good old regurgitated worm to be delivered. And 2 of them are tiny, and one of them is like 4 times as big as the others. And it's obviously that this one is the cuckoo egg or whatever he was dropped in that nest, but it doesn't end there. The mother comes and feeds them all equally, although the big one can kind of get more, and his mouth is bigger. But then while the mother bird is gone, the big one skillfully and steadily pushes both of the other little ones out of the nest. And so he just ends up being the only one in the nest. And then after that, he gets all the regurgitated worm. I mean, brutal. One of my friends said that, she can't watch nature movies because they're too brutal because of things like that. My thought was, oh my gosh, the karma begins so early. Each of those little beings is a jiva. It's an individual spark of the divinity. Master said he remembers all the way back to being a diamond. That means that each of those little beings has an individual spark of divinity, and that spark of divinity is going to become a self-realized master. So these instinctive aversions that we have to the bullies that we meet in our life or the siblings that we had, were we 2 of those little birds or one of those little birds that was pushed out of the nest by that big bully? And then we meet him or her later in our lives and we have such an aversion to him. I mean, it's very, very tricky. Now, this is all actually related to what I'm about to talk about, because what we're talking about is how complicated it is to extricate ourselves from the delusions that bind us. And we have this very false idea, even about what the spiritual path is. We just think, well, I find that I have a flaw, I get rid of that flaw, and then I go on. It's a very linear sort of point of view. And it's a very I can do it point of view. And the difficulty on the spiritual path is really simple. Well, it's simple to say, because in order to break away from the power of Maya, which just holds us like this and tells us so powerfully that what we're looking for is outside of ourselves, we have to have a great deal of egoic power. We have to take this individuality and we have to declare it on a level that often is a huge fight, just a huge fight. When I was first traveling in India, which is a culture much more generationally intertwined than America is now, it's changing, but not that quickly. And this is the best and the worst of the country. It's very intertwined like this. And obeying your parents and doing what your parents ask you is much more the given. It's much more daring to defy your parents than it is in America. That's the best and the worst. That's the good news, and that's also the bad news. If your parents are wise and generous, it's fine. If your parents are not wise and generous, it can bind you. It also holds the next generation to the images of the generation before and doesn't allow for the same kind of creative thinking and innovation and change that is necessary, especially in an ascending yuga. And so the first time this came really vividly to me was when I was giving a satsang in Bangalore to a small group of friends, Ananda friends, new friends I'd just met. I was talking about meeting Swamiji, and at the age of 22, just changing my life completely, and a year and a half later, just selling everything I had and walking away, going to Ananda village. I mean, not that I had much at that age, but just turning my back on everything, going to Ananda village, and 50 years later, I never looked back. And they said, "What did your parents think?" And I mean, I chuckle a little bit. And I just looked at them and I thought, I never asked them. I didn't think I answered. I never asked them. It was even worse. It never occurred to me to ask them. I told them. That was different. But I never asked them. And partly it was my karma, just the way that I am constituted. Partly it was culture. But it was also that, with all due respect, my parents were very fine people. I'm deeply grateful for the way they raised me, deeply so. But they didn't know anything about it. They didn't know anything about Swami Kriyananda or self-realization or what I was going to do. They simply weren't qualified to comment. Any answer they would have given me would have been from their context. And I had earlier than that, but I had stepped completely outside their context. And so when I was working in India, working meaning sharing these teachings in India, not vacationing or on pilgrimage, often people would come to me with this dilemma. And I was a little bewildered as to what to say. So I did a little research. I asked people who'd lived in India, Americans longer than I, who'd been there when Swami was there. I said, "What do you do when a woman or a man comes to you and said, my parents are insisting I marry. They want me to marry this particular person. I don't feel that that's suitable. They want me to go into this profession. I'm not inclined." And my American answer would have been, "It's your life." I said that to a woman because he was talking about her in-laws and her husband. And we were close friends. I said, "Well, it's your life." She just started laughing and laughing. "Of course it's not my life," she said. "It belongs to my children, to my parents, to my husband. It's not my own life." But really our lives belong to God. And in her case, it was her true Dharma and she was doing it beautifully. In other cases, in my book, Ask Asha, for example, there's a question from an Indian woman who said her parents are forcing her to get married in a certain way to a certain man she doesn't want to marry. I said, "No, actually, they're not forcing you. You are an adult person. You have a passport. You have a job. There's no force here. What you're saying is it would be highly inconvenient for you to refuse because the pleasant relationships you have would be jeopardized." I wasn't telling her what she ought to do. In fact, in this case, I thought she was being willful rather than intuitive about it. So I was more inclined for her to go along with what her parents were asking than not. But we needed to get it clear, And so I asked people, what did Swami say when people presented issues? Swami said, "It's your life." And so what I was coming to here is, at a certain point, I use India and my experience there as a powerful illustration because I know many people face enormous pressure from the outside, whether it's family or whatever it is, or internally because of financial concerns or whatever the karma is. They feel enormous pressure to go along with society as it is because it appears to be, this is the weird thing, it appears to be the easier route. So, but there has to come a point, and Swami had a wonderful phrase, where you put a rock in the river, he said, where you put a rock in the river and you force the river to flow around the rock. Instead of just always going with the river, you plant yourself. And even though the force of the river is still coming, it has to go around you. So this is what we have to do before we can get onto the spiritual path. We have to just look at the world as it is and say, I think there's something really wrong here. I was a yogi for many lifetimes before this one, and at the age of 10, I stared out the window and I just thought, there's something really wrong here. It was a perfectly happy life. I had a wonderful childhood, sitting in a comfortable home, looking out at a very nice neighborhood, with this profound sense that there's something really wrong here. And when I was 18, I read self-realization teachings, and it was like, this is it. Oh, this is it. I get it now. Somebody actually does know what I want to know. And basically, I put a rock in the river at that point. It took me a little while to get out of the river, but there you are. The end point is that same enormous personal power, that self-definition, that I can do it and I must do it and I will, and I've trained myself to say this is my life, is absolutely essential to get onto the spiritual path. And then we have to learn something completely different. And then we have to learn how to gather up all that personal power and to attune it with a higher wisdom, which is the will of God. And specifically when you're on a path like this one, where discipleship is really fundamental. Discipleship is fundamental to all spiritual paths, because the problem is the ego, which is our self-directed will, how we take the life force that comes from the divine and use it as our self-directed will. It can only take us so far, because we're moving into terrain where the ego literally can't go. In the story of Moses and the Jews wandering in the desert, they wandered for 40 years looking for the promised land. Swamiji has humorously remarked, if you look at it on the map, it's a very small place. In 40 years, they could have covered every square inch. So it can't literally be that he had no sense of direction and they were wandering around in circles. He said, in that particular story, Moses was a self-realized master. Judaism is a true religion. He was an avatar. He was the prophet, the Messiah for those people. And he took of the slave people, and he molded them into a people, a religious people. And that's why Judaism continues in its vibrant form today, is because its origins are a true revelation of God. But in that story, Moses represents the egoic self, and he can see the promised land. That's how the story is, but he can't enter it. Now, of course, Moses was also an avatar, so the images get all, we're not talking about Moses himself. But wilderness is when you're wandering in the field of meditation looking for God realization. That's what it always represents. And the ego directs the self, to focus its attention on these higher realities. But when the moment of realization comes, the ego ceases to exist. And when we're moving into that state of realization, when we'll use our little title now, trying to live in the light, it becomes a constant diminishment of the ego's influence in order to allow the soul to express itself. It's a very wonderful and enjoyable experience that begins to happen, where things happen, but one is so conscious of the fact that it's simply not one's own doing. One of the reasons that creative artistic expression is so helpful on the spiritual path is that when you really attune yourself to that creative flow, the ego is just not in charge anymore. The ego itself sort of just watches the creative work happen, and when it's finished, there's no personal sense of responsibility for it. You were there, it happened, you remembered, you used your hands or your mind to make it happen, but what happened was not your own. So what that begins to tune us into is this idea of attunement, that what's really happening on the spiritual path is there is this ray of grace. That's what Swami called it perfectly. That's what this whole little booklet is about. There's this divine force of energy. And Master himself said that his coming to this world as the last in a line of these 5 gurus, which is, before today we just finished, or nearly just finished, talking about all these gurus and how they've influenced us. Collectively, they've made this powerful ray of grace that is vibrating in the cosmos. And our spiritual progress is dependent not so much on how we get ourselves organized and discipline ourselves, as to how much we actually put aside everything that we call self and just attune to that vibration and let that vibration come through us. And it's attunement with that energy that really makes us into something else. See, all of this is about just breaking. We have to break, crack open so many just seemingly obvious but totally wrong ideas. We are not in any way a fixed reality. We can study metaphysically, and it's worth doing, the chakras and how that works, and the kundalini, and we practice kriya. We do all these things that attune us to the more subtle realities of what my consciousness really is. But at a certain point, we have to realize that nothing that I think of as myself is really myself. I am a pattern of energy. I mean, from one second to the next, I'm just a pattern of energy. That's all that I am. And even the physicality of my body and the world around me, it's just a pattern of energy. And therefore, what matters is what vibration of energy I'm operating on, what waves of energy I'm allowing to flow through me. And these are hard things to say, but meaning to say in a way that communicates, but perhaps it can point us all in the right direction. And that we either vibrate on the level of this powerful, egoic, self-determined being that I've spent lots of incarnations building to the point where it can be on the spiritual path, so that I can say, it doesn't matter. And instead of saying, it's your life, let me phrase it differently. Now I say it's your life, but I'm speaking not to myself anymore. I'm not telling myself it's my life, or saying to myself in the third person, it's your life, do what you think you should do. No, I say to Divine Mother, it's your life. I say to Master, it's your life. I say to Swamiji, it's your life. And have it be more than just words, but have it be an actual release of all that tension of holding myself separate, and realize that that was just a means to an end. It was a tool that I used to break through the door, but I don't need it now that I've broken through the door. In fact, just the opposite. I really need to set it down and just let this ray of grace become who I am. That's what Swami writes about. That's what I want to talk about. A new dispensation. This new meaning sent in this time. New because before Master came, it operated differently. This is a particular expression of the divine and has particular characteristics and particular ways that we can attune to it. And that's what I'd like to share with you and will share with you in the days to come. God bless you.